Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, blood boy of the contemporary American intellectual scene. Today's part two of my two-part episode on Terry Gross. On episode one, which was one of my monthly paid episodes, I talked to Sarah Hepola, Jason Thurlkill, and Megan Daum about Terry Gross, about what makes her great, about NPR, about who should replace her whenever she chooses to retire, which might be tomorrow, might be 30 years from now. On this episode, which is a freebie, I talked to Mark Oppenheimer, Mike Pesca, and Jesse Adams about the same topics, that we go in different directions. My sense is that if I had added too many more guests, maybe even one more guest, I would have started to repeat myself in a way that made the show less interesting. But as it is, with the 6 guests, the 2 episodes, I think I more or less nailed it, somewhat accidentally. At least it never felt repetitive to me as I re-listened to the interviews. That may also be a testament to the narrative skills of my editor-producer, Robert Scaramuccia, who no doubt cut the parts that went over already covered territory and left in the stuff that felt fresh. So thanks to Robert for taking that on. I will pop back in to introduce my second and third guest, but my first guest on this episode is my brother, Mark Oppenheimer, a previous guest on Eminent Americans. He is, among other things, host of his own podcast, the ARC podcast, or ARC with Mark, as he sometimes calls it, which is the flagship podcast of the magazine he edits about religion and politics. He is the author of many books, but I was about to say the most recent, but it's actually not yet out in the world. The author of Judy Blume, A Life, which is the forthcoming biography of the young adult author Judy Blume, which drops in March of 2026. Before we get to the conversation, I want to drop in one last clip of Terry herself from a recent episode just a few weeks ago when she interviewed Ben Stiller about his recent documentary about his parents, Jerry Stiller and Ann Mira. It's just a short clip, but it does 2 things that I think are worth noting. One is letting us hear Terry say fresh air. I didn't do that right, but she has a distinctive way of saying that, which a few of my guests remark upon. The other is just hearing the genuineness in her voice as she welcomes Stiller to the show and tells him how much she enjoyed the movie. Listening to it, you're just like, well, that is real feeling that is being conveyed in a public, I guess in some sense, artificial setting, but that capacity to do that, to convey real feeling and real reaction to what's happening in the moment is one of the hallmarks of her performance as a radio host, I guess, as a podcast host, and it's part of what makes her great. So let me play that clip.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. My guest Ben Stiller has made a very personal documentary about his parents and what it was like to be their son. Ben Stiller, welcome back to Fresh Air. This is a really probing, emotionally deep movie. I really, really liked it.
All right, now on to my interview with Mark Oppenheimer. Mark, welcome back to Eminent Americans. I don't know how many times you've been on now. I'm going to stop counting. But this is a special episode of Eminent Americans where I'm interviewing a bunch of people about who should be the successor to Terry Gross on Fresh Air. And I thought you might have some interesting thoughts. I guess, before we get into your thoughts on who else it might be, would you be a good successor to Terry Gross on Fresh Air? You've done a lot of podcasting. I mean, you have the background, both in the sense that you've done years of podcasting, but also, if memory serves, didn't you actually sub in for Colin McEnroe on his talk show on NPR? Weren't you a kind of an occasional substitute host? So you've actually you've sat in the chair in some sense.
I have sat, maybe a dozen or 24 times in the local Connecticut NPR version of Terry Gross, the Colin McEnroe show. And that is a pretty similar show to Terry Gross's.
Can you do an honest, candid assessment of kind of what the pros and cons of you are as a potential successor to Terry Gross?
I think you've known me long enough to know. I think you've been my brother long enough to know that I'm not a practitioner of false modesty. I'd be happy to say if I thought I'd be good at this. I don't think I'd be particularly good at it, or shall I say it'd be a very different show, and it wouldn't fill the niche that NPR needs to fill with Fresh Air. The thing that Terry Gross is pretty good at is the kind of egoless retirement out of the space. I mean, not that she doesn't have a voice and an ego, but she's very good at, I think, setting up the guest with an intelligent question, not a kind of dumb question that just like makes the guest do all the work, but prompting with a certain kind of intelligent preamble and preface and question the guest to really take up the space and be the guest. And I think I'm too big a presence and have too much voice to be that guy. I have a hard time subtracting myself from the space and really letting someone else have the platform. which is more, I am more like in this way, although not in other ways, like a Joe Rogan, right? Like you tune in kind of to see Joe Rogan. You listen to Mark Maron kind of to hear Mark Maron. And he, by being really present with his guest, he gets good stuff out of the guest, but you also end up with a very strong sense of who Mark Maron is. And he's very much an equal personality on the show. And that's kind of what my old podcast, Unorthodox, was like, that I did for, for 7 years for Tablet Magazine. It's like my co-host and I were as much the stars as any guest we had on any given day. And I think what Terry Gross is really good at is that, obviously we recognize her voice and she's a pop culture figure because she's been ubiquitous for so long in certain circles, but we don't really know anything about her. She subtracts herself from the space pretty well. And I think that's the job for that show.
So I would say two things in response to that. One is one of my other guests on this show made the argument, which I found fairly persuasive, that in fact, part of the appeal of Terry is that we do come to know her, but we only come to know her cumulatively and incrementally. She does let occasional autobiographical things drop, but also just in the way that she responds to questions and the commentary we make, that part of the power of Terry is in fact that we come to know her, but it's in a different way. I take your point. It's in a different way than we come to know Mark Maron, where you can listen to 5 episodes and you would feel like you knew who Mark Maron was and you knew a lot of his, his biography and his preoccupations or something like that. Whereas with Terry, you have to listen to 50 or 100 or something like that. The other thing I'd say to this, and this is kind of a working hypothesis I've kind of developed as I've done these interviews, is I actually think the ideal successor to Terry Gross is more in that space. They're not all the way to Mark Maron, where, or Andrew Sullivan or something like that, where it sometimes feels as if 50% of the show is them talking, right? Like they're just there as equal or almost equal. But maybe that it's going to be more Joe Rogan in a sense. The thing to do to sort of evolve the show while still staying in the kind of NPR space is to have more personality, not all the way to Mark Maron, but that it would actually be a mistake to try and replicate the sort of Terry Gross, primarily centering the guest, being somewhat self-effacing, though that is in fact what I expect NPR to do.
Yeah,
but I think it's a mistake.
Well, that's interesting. I want to circle back to why you think it's a mistake. It strikes me that the mistake of putting someone in with too much voice. I mean, I like Mike Pesca. I've been on his show a few times. I think he's a great interviewer. But the problem with Mike Pesca or Mark Maron or the host of 1A, whose name I forget right now, or a lot of people out there, is their politics are kind of front and center. Their cultural space is kind of front and center. If you listen to them 10 times, you sort of know where they're coming from. Even when they're trying to be objective, you kind of know what their angle is. And I just think that they'd be big hits with a third of the current listenership, and they would maintain another third, and then they would turn off a third. It seems to me like this is a space. And I think NPR interviewers, Robert Siegel was very good at this. He had a little more voice than Terry, but very good at just being broadly. Isn't the job of a BBC or an NPR presenter to be charming but bland in a way that makes you a good presenter for the whole country, or as much of it as you can? Why is that not? And obviously the person would be different from Terry Gross in all sorts of particulars, but why is that not the goal being striven for?
So I'll say first, you're probably right. So I'm being a little bit obstinate in arguing this with you, but I'll at least make the case for why. I guess because what I expect to happen if NPR appoints, I guess it has to do with maintaining fresh air as a unique cultural property on the landscape. In other words, if the goal is just to see fresh air as kind of subordinate to the sort of broader NPR identity, then I think you're right. If the goal is for fresh air, which has been this sort of unique and influential production in the American cultural landscape, then appointing a Tanya Mosley, who's our current co-host, or a Dave Davies, or somebody in that mold, or Sam Fragoso, who's maybe somebody we'll talk about, who I think has very much modeled himself on Terry Gross. What it guarantees, because they won't be Terry Gross, is that the importance of fresh air will recede. So what I imagine is if you found the right person who was more voicey, and I think that would be easier to find than somebody who was like Terry Gross and somehow as compelling as she is and distinctive, is yes, it would sort of alienate some of the listenership, so that the mass listenership would decrease, but it would have a much better chance of preserving fresh air as a distinctive and kind of influential space in the cultural landscape. That's the argument I'll make. I'm not sure if I believe it.
I think that's right. There's a reason that Fresh Air is a thing that Talk of the Nation with Neil Conan, there have been a lot of these shows that have been kind of one host, one guest. And there is a reason, I think you're right, that that Fresh Air has loomed larger. Part of it is that she does have certain quirks that she, the way she says fresh air, like there's, and it's been going so long. And there is a way in which, I mean, is it unfair to her to say that she's the kind of archetype that's being made fun of by like Saturday Night Live's Sweaty Balls sketch? Or, I mean, when people think of the NPR tote bag woman or man,
right,
one imagines they're huge Terry Gross fans in the way that for a time one imagined they were huge Ira Glass fans. But Terry Gross is Ira is still a bit of an acquired taste, and there are people who don't like him, who are turned off by his verbal hesitations and whatever. Terry Gross is has given us our sense of what an NPR interviewer sounds like. Maybe Scott Simon has been that a little bit too, a little bit Robert Siegel, but it is true that I'm conceding your point that she's first among equals, very clearly first among equals. And what you're saying, as I hear you, is she needs to be replaced by someone who will be big enough and unique enough that the show will remain first among equals, not just recede into, one more show. So I hear that.
Imagine this scenario, and then I'll let you finish. Imagine they appointed, which I think they were never going to do, though he probably fooled himself into thinking they were. Imagine they appointed Dave Davies as successor to Terry Gross. This seems like a ridiculous thing to say, but I believe it. If they appointed Dave Davies as successor to Terry Gross, I'm sure, whatever analysis they do of the number of listeners they have, it would be relatively vast. I think Eminent Americans with Daniel Oppenheimer would be a more influential podcast in the discourse than Fresh Air with Dave Davies. Like, I have enough journalists and editors and writers and people like that who listen to me and experience me as a sort of distinctive presence in the cultural landscape.
Are you sure you're not already more influential than Fresh Air in that sense? Because she doesn't do intellectual interviews with difficult intellectuals the way you do.
I guess it depends what we mean by influence, right? If it's a sort of explicit or sort of direct influence on like who people are reading or what kind of how they're conceptualizing ideas, there's a sort of vaguely plausible case to make. I mean, I think Terry's influence has been just more on the sort of the ways in which people do radio and podcasting and things like that. So it's a different it's kind of an aesthetic influence rather than a kind of intellectual influence in some sense. But if Dave Davies were her successor, he would have no kind of either of those influences, right? Because he's just downstream of Terry in terms of what his aesthetics are, but then also he's not bringing any kind of more overt intellectual or cultural perspective to it.
I mean, it seems to me that we're dancing around the question of what is it that she does really, really well. And I'll put this out there. I think you probably listened to, or you certainly thought about her more, if only to prepare for these episodes, than I have. And I don't listen to her that much. But my sense of what she does very well, and I mean, I've probably heard hundreds of her episodes over the years, but not as many in the past 5 years, let's say. I'm going to posit as a theory, going back 30 years now. I mean, now everyone thinks that pop culture deserves close intellectual scrutiny. There's, everyone's a popist now. I think that she was the person who, if you go back to the 90s, let's say, was having on Stephen Bochco, prestige TV creators, and asking them questions as if they were Harold Bloom or Lionel Trilling or whatever. That she was the person who basically said to her NPR listeners, all of whom secretly were watching, Thursday Night Lineup on NBC, this is important stuff. This is culture making. I have watched it so carefully. I spent, like, this past week, I wasn't reading the latest Philip Roth or Barbara Kingsolver or Don DeLillo or whatever the novel of the moment was in 1995. I was watching VHSs of every episode of, NYPD Blue or St. Elsewhere or whatever.
Did he do Hill Street Blues?
Hill Street Blues. Yeah, thank you. That's what I was looking for. And then asked him probing questions about the art of television. And that she has always been not even a secret lowbrow or middlebrow, but a proud examiner of mass culture in a space that 30 years ago had a lot less space for that. And she continues to do it in a way that's not identity politics driven or politics driven. That is to say, she's not having on, if she has on the women from Two Dope Queens, like, she's not primarily interested in their politics or their blackness. She's interested in the craft of comedy. She treats them as real artists. And I think that, like, that's a hard thing to replicate because I think she genuinely, like, do you remember how many episodes she seemed to do on The Wire? Like, she was genuinely obsessed in a way that was unique. And so What I would say is that the space to fill might not be her particular mojo or style, but somebody, and you would be good at this, and so would Pesca, somebody who is genuinely, authentically curious about mass art forms as the subjects of like super close intellectual scrutiny, which is another reason I wouldn't be as good at it, because like I like that stuff, but I don't think I read it as closely as you do.
It's interesting. You brought up a word that I think has been implicit in a lot of these discussions, but has not popped into my head till now, but is profoundly important, which is middlebrow. And I'm venturing into territories where I feel like I don't have as much knowledge as I should to talk about these things. But NPR has been such a profound and important middlebrow institution in American life. Since when? See, I feel like you probably know this history better than I do. I think it was a pretty boring, square, uninteresting, even as a middlebrow product endeavor. And then wasn't there some kind of like shift? Was it the 70s or 80s when a lot of these people came in?
I can vaguely tell you what happened. I mean, it's something I once knew better. But yes, so I think it started as a sort of loose network of stations in the early 70s. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting started giving a little money, though that's never been a primary funder. It slowly developed a kind of a few national products. So Car Talk, Prairie Home Companion. And then for a long, long time, I think I'm on pretty safe ground saying its products were Morning Edition for a couple hours in the morning, All Things Considered for a couple hours in the afternoon, and then weekends like Car Talk, Prairie Home Companion. But most of the day on most stations through the 80s was classical music or maybe jazz. And then there was a moment, and here, certainly lots of people know this better than I, but there was a moment, I want to say in the 90s, maybe the mid 90s, when all of those stations like WFCR that we grew up with in Amherst, Northampton, WNPR in Hartford, WK whatever in KYW in Philadelphia, they basically dropped classical music and filled their day. All of a sudden, like, you know, Talk of the Nation and blah, 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 and all of these, Terry Fresh Air, were filling the midday for
This
everybody.
American Life.
This American Life, which ran nights, and they had nighttime programming. Snap, I mean, you go a little bit later, you have Snap Judgment and all these things becoming, some of which are not NPR produced. I want to be clear on that.
Right.
Some of them
are
are
from that, right. Wait, Don't Tell Me is another one.
Wait, Don't Tell Me was a weekend show. But the weekdays became all news channels.
Right.
And that was not the first 20 years. The first 20 years was a couple news products, morning and afternoon, surrounded by classical or jazz. And so, yes, once they became all news products, they ceased to be these kind of highbrow. I mean, what they've been was classical stations that had thrown on some very good news programs. And then they became mass product stations with a lot of mass audience interview shows. And in some ways, their brow dropped from kind of high to middle at that point. And I think Terry Gross was probably a central product of that because she was a weekday, everyday product that was all of a sudden on hundreds of stations.
Trying to think between the two of us, if we can get a pretty clear sense of what we mean by middlebrow. I mean, I haven't read my Dwight McDonald Mass Cult and Mid Cult in a while, so this is going to be.
You haven't done your annual rereading of Dwight McDonald.
That's right. But what I think of as middlebrow, or one piece of it is, and this is the more sort of contemptuous, critical perspective of it, which is it's like the simulacrum of real culture, high culture, sufficiently pre-digested and sanded down so that the sort of upper middle class, bourgeois, educated listenership who really don't want their lives, their intellects, their psyches discombobulated by difficulty that highbrow culture would force upon them can feel like they're getting the good stuff, like they're eating their broccoli, but in a way that's entertaining and goes down smooth. I think that's some version of the kind of Dwight McDonald take on what middlebrow culture is. I think there's a lot of value to that. I think I'm less critical of it. Like, I think that middlebrow culture in the NPR sense actually serves a really important function as just a kind of institution in our sort of pluralistic liberal democracy to sort of hold things together and create some consensus and some sort of shared narratives and things like that. Like, I actually think these are important institutions. And I think at their most excellent, and I would put Terry Gross in this, they have real kind of aesthetic, artistic integrity. Does that seem right to you in the kind of what middlebrow is?
Yeah, I think that does sound right. I mean, I'm trying to think of it in different veins, right? So in classical music, it's a lot of the stuff that our ears have gotten used to. It's Mozart, it's Pachelbel, it's the overture from Carmen, but it's not the atonal, it's not Bartok, it's not whatever. So it's the stuff I like, not the stuff that I don't. Like, I'm perfectly middlebrow about my classical music taste. I'm trying to think, like, what would Terry Gross not have on because it's too highbrow? The kind of stuff you do, some of the thinkers who don't seem particularly influential in an obvious way, but really are and are difficult, I don't think she's had on. Like, I'd be curious if she's had on George Shalaba. I wonder how often she had on Noam Chomsky. I wonder, would she have on Blake Smith or Julius Krein or some of these, right-wing post-liberals?
Yeah, I don't think she would do an episode, when there was a lot of discussion about Foucault and biopolitics and the way in
Right.
which his critique had been adopted by people on the right to criticize COVID restrictions and things like that. When Ross Douthat was writing columns in the New York Times referencing all that stuff, explicitly, directly referencing all that stuff, I would imagine that Terry Gross didn't touch on it at all, didn't even have anybody on who sort of offhandedly mentioned it, because it would, it's not deliberate, but it's like, because structurally it would make her listeners uncomfortable that they don't know who Foucault is.
But also because the aesthetics of it are a little more jagged, right?
Yeah,
like there's a
right.
way in which, so one of the things that Prestige TV did was it took, the video aesthetic is not avant-garde film aesthetic. It's not the Cremaster cycle. It's not Fellini. They took the most digestible post-MTV, quick cutting, pleasurable editing vernacular and basically put it to shows with better dialogue, better plotting, et cetera, better acting. And that's comfortable for her. But, some of the stuff that like Ross Douthat processes for us in his columns, I'm thinking of like Paul Kingsnorth's new book, which I just read. It's actually quite enjoyable and it's not difficult, but it starts off as a bit of a slog and it's long. It's not pre-digested in the way that mass market books often are. And therefore, it's not her aesthetic. Her aesthetic is not interested in that kind of slightly avant-garde, a little bit jagged, angular spikiness.
Yeah, and I don't want to go too far. She would have Toni Morrison. She probably did have Toni Morrison on the podcast, right? Toni Morrison wrote difficult books.
Yeah.
Difficult, I don't know if avant-garde, but in some cases, experimental books. The experience of Terry Gross talking to Toni Morrison, I would imagine, was one that was relatively easy for the listeners to digest. And I don't say that in a critical way. I think Terry was great, but I think it was a middlebrow product. And so thinking about like who her successor would be, this is why it's not me. I don't want to, not that I'm so highbrow, but I'm just too jagged in that sense. Like I'm too interested and I'm too bored sitting around listening to people tell me things I already know.
I think the other thing is your show, like Andrew Sullivan's show, is comfortable presuming a lot of knowledge on the part of the listener.
That's right.
If the listener's not there yet, you figure the listener will catch up, or they'll Google it, or they're
not my audience,
or they're not your audience, or they don't care, or they're hearing references. Like, I don't know that I've read a lot of Foucault, but I've heard enough references and I can fill in the gaps. And I'm not, I'm happy to do that work. I'm happy to have people reference stuff I haven't read in front of me. But I don't think she ever does that. I think, and it's not intentional. It's not condescension to her listener. I think she naturally is someone, her read of things doesn't depend on this incredibly deep, thick learning, or her interviews never presume that kind of learning. And someone like Andrew Sullivan is totally accessible and, does interviews while he's, on pod and swears a lot and talks about gay sex. Like he's nobody's idea of like stuffy, but he'll start saying something about Oakeshott, the British philosopher Oakeshott. Right. And just like roll with it. And his guests know who that is. And he presumes his audience is like fine with him talking Oakeshott. And that's not something she would do. And in that sense, I think she's like Pesca would be a good slot into that chair. Somebody who wouldn't get it, but actually would be fabulous is Ross Douthat. Because he's really interested. He's unafraid of anything super highbrow and intellectual. He would be very good at pulling in, political philosophical thinkers and making them accessible. And of course, at heart, he's basically like a TV, movie, sci-fi, fantasy nerd. There's nobody who sees more. Ross is still, I think, the film critic for National Review. Like nobody except maybe you spends more of their late night watching, movies and sort of deep cable channel, low budget sci-fi and like enjoys it, but also thinks seriously about it, also can place it in context. And and I think what would be interesting about him is liberated from the role of being the Times' Catholic conservative op-ed columnist, it would be surprising to a lot of people, though not to me, how many of his episodes would be about novels, TV, comics, movies, whatever.
That's a great idea. And I'm surprised he hadn't occurred to me. But it's interesting. Somebody said to me, somebody who has been really profoundly alienated by what he perceives of as kind of the left woke turn of NPR over the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of our discussion was about like, what would it look like for NPR if you accept the premise that they alienated a lot of their sort of middle of the road listeners, center right listeners, centrist listeners, between 2015 and 2025 or something like that. And they need to do some repair. This was a mechanism of repair. And so immediately you start thinking about who's a conservative thinker, but it can't be somebody too conservative because NPR's base is kind of center-left liberal listeners. And the name David Brooks came up, but I think we both agree that David Brooks is not the right person. He's too kind of milquetoast or something like that. But Ross is the better version of that. Like Ross is super, super smart as just about anybody out there. And he seems like he's read everything. And he has this, as you said, he has this profound and earnest interest in pop culture, which I think Terry did also. Yeah, he'd be great. And it's funny because, Ezra would never do it because he's probably paid 10 times more at the Times than he would be at NPR.
Well, it's funny. I wonder about this, right? Because I know people at the Times who are like pretty good and pretty well established and making, say, 200. I mean, I've asked them, like, what do you make? And it's like 180 or 200. And I've looked at, if you look at job postings at the Times, the reporter jobs are union jobs and they will have the range. So it'll be like 170 to 210 or whatever. And I've wondered, like, what is Ezra's deal? Because he could surely go solo on Substack with his podcast and make $1 million a year.
Well, that's why. Don't you think they pay stars? I don't know.
I'm sure they have the prerogative to, and I think opinion is probably, they might be in the guild the way the reporters are, but I don't think they can justify paying them more than, say, $400 a year. I just don't. Within the culture of the Times, I don't think you can have reporters making $2 million and Ezra Klein making $1 million. And if I'm right, he's leaving enormous amounts of money on the table to have the prestige and the platform and also the production assistance of the Times. Maybe he doesn't want to run a business and have to hire his own video producers or whatever. That's neither here nor there. But
putting that aside, I actually think Ross is better for fresh air. Ross really has that kind of omnicompetence in all sorts of realms.
And Ezra Klein is also by nature, I don't know if he's good at math, but he has the soul of a quant. Like he's a poli-sci guy in his heart. And Ross is not. I mean, I don't know if Ross, you wouldn't shock me to hear that Ross failed out of pre-cal. Like he's a mystic. And I think that's a better person, a better type to be interviewing about art. And for the show for the audience Terry Gross is going to leave behind, I think that's a better person to have hosting it. I should say I am one of those people who believes the charges that NPR simply went too far to the left in its sensibility. I don't think that's as serious a charge, when people level it against, say, the New York Times, for example. I think there's great stuff, there's bad stuff, but it still strikes me as a broadly objective product in a way that NPR doesn't. Like, I just think I think it's a very banal explanation, which is given what the culture's gone through in the past 10 years, and given that most stories are produced and hosted by 22 to 35-year-old elite college grads, there's no staffing there that knows how to sound objective in a pre-George Floyd way. They don't have the talent, and they don't pay enough to get the talent. They are at the whim of people who are willing to come and work for 35 or 40 a year at a small station and maybe rise up and be a producer for one of the bigger shows. So it's a huge pipeline problem for them. I think that, like, if you got someone in who had someone like Douthat's conservative base and leanings and was really smart, and he's insanely respectful of people he disagrees with when he interviews them.
That's right.
And so he'd initially lose like 20%. They just make no way. Like they'd read some explainer in Axios that would tell them you can't listen to Douthat. But actually people who listened would find that he is really good with people he disagrees with.
I think that's right. I think you just connect to, he exudes a lot of soulfulness and humanity. And I think, yes. And that would do I think it would do some repair. I think it would do a lot of repair with the centrist and center right people who are alienated. It's interesting to think about, that comparison between NPR and the Times and sort of is this the right word? Is phenomenological? What's the word for like your sort of in the moment experience of the world?
Sure.
Is it okay.
Yeah, sure. Phenomenological.
Okay. So like, I think one's phenomenological experience of the New York Times and NPR are very different. And I think maybe the alienation and the anger and resentment towards NPR relative to the Times is partially a product of what you said being true, which is I think it did turn more and in a sort of more homogenous way to the left than the Times did. But I think it's also the sort of the experience people had of listening to NPR. It was kind of background music, right? It was both background music, but it was also like there was an intimacy to it, right? Radio, podcasts, they're in your ear or something like that. People would turn on NPR first thing in the morning and they would listen, they'd tune in, they'd tune out, they feel reassured, they feel soothed. And they had achieved this sort of extraordinary collective voice in that sense, which I think they fucked up And I think it made people super angry, and probably in ways that like they're not even conscious of, and that took a lot of time for them to really kind of surface to where they were angry about stuff. I don't think people experience the New York Times in the same way, right? It's a different kind of relationship to the
The
content.
Times has also been much better about covering its, maybe you would call it populist flank, like the fact that they have Wordle, the fact they have Spelling Bee, the fact that they have a suite of podcasts, which are better and worse depending on who you are. But I mean, or someone like Ezra Klein, who is soothing in a middlebrow way, and I mean that as a compliment. Like he does the thing he does in a way that would have played well on the old NPR. They've been very good at finding, I mean, one of the raps on their op-ed page is that it can feel very like center left to center right and middle brow. And they don't have a monarchist and they don't have an anarchist and they don't like, there's interesting thought going on out there that they don't platform. And partly I think that's a choice. And they've stayed, yes, they've stayed soothing and they've had some fun product. I mean, they just shut down their kids edition, which I think was sad, but they were doing that. The magazine has some fun parts. NPR, sure, you could tune into Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, but the daily news product of Morning Edition and All Things Considered, there was a period where it felt incredibly bleak and lugubrious and angry and turned up to 11. And I haven't listened. I mean, I don't put it on in the car, partly for like, I end up getting angered. And they would do that thing where like they, try to get left-wing and right-wing voices, but the right-wing voice would be someone who's actually just like, like barely centrist. I mean, they simply didn't know how to give space to what a lot of people in the country were feeling. I want to say one other thing just quickly because I've thought about what works. The other thing would work about Ross Douthat, which would work about, Robert Siegel, if they brought him back and other people. You really can't go wrong going very smart.
Yeah.
And I think there's a misconception and Terry Gross is very smart.
Yes.
And I think there's a misconception that when you want broad audiences, the thing to do is to go sort of dumb or simple or easy. And one of the things I've learned from the best editors I've had is that actually it's much stickier for readers when you're really giving them like knotty, complex ideas. And your job is then to write them with smooth prose, but that actually people are really pulled into difficult, thorny stuff. And so the mistake also that a lot of the NPR hosts, a lot of their choices for hosts make is that they don't sound much better read or engaged or intrigued or curious than like the local news person, that sort of 10 a.m. show on your local news channel. And what you want is people like Christopher Lydon and Robert Siegel, who you get the feeling are super nerdy, but also know how to explain the stuff to the guys at their poker game.
That's a good point, and I think is like something worth saying about Terry, which is I think when she was talking to people, you had the sense that the questions she was asking them came from, even though she was centering them, you had this sort of implicit sense they came from her having a genuine understanding of what she was talking about, right? She'd read the novel, she'd, paid attention to the politics, she'd listened to the comedy, the stand-up comedy or something like that. And she had her own thoughts on it, and her question was kind of emerged from that.
She was also the old 1970s New York, Upper West Side, even though she's a Philadelphian, culture vulture, which is to say, like, there was that figure, and, he was often a type in a Woody Allen movie or in a New Yorker cartoon, who was like, maybe had a kid or two, but was not primarily a nurturer, was in analysis, had a master's degree from the New School, and just loved like what they really lived for was how much Susan Sontag being their idol, right? Who just, they said, compulsively consumed culture from morning till night. What they lived for was going to the 92nd Street Y and Symphony Space and the Met and just like life was about consuming as much culture as you could. And the fact that Terry Gross, and I say this with like no derision at all, I think it's actually like a beautiful archetype, that she was like married, but her husband didn't seem to enter into it. I don't think she has children. She did not have any writing projects of her own, as far as I know. She was not seeking to create culture. She was a pure fan in that highbrow sense that's almost passé of just like being put on earth to just devour and process and think about culture and join book groups and debate circles and chautauquas and whatever. And she made a career out of it. It's like, wow, and she made the time for it in her life. Like, I don't think she was doing anything else. And there's something kind of beautiful about that because it feels very old fashioned.
Is that an archetype? Is that an identified archetype of the culture vulture? Did you just make that up?
No, I didn't make that up. No, go. It needs to be brought back. It's something you would see in like Janet Malcolm or Sontag. They would sometimes write a little bit wryly about their fellow culture vultures. And the idea was you had a subscription. I mean, grandma and grandpa, our grandparents were a little bit like this. They were not as highbrow. They didn't know as much, but The idea was you got a subscription to everything. You had the whole season at the theater. You had the whole season at the symphony. You went to the readings at the whatever. You were on the mailing lists for the library speaker series, the this speaker series, the synagogue speaker series. You just fucking went to everything. That's what life was for.
I mean, part of this project, I realize, as you say that, is a kind of mourning for a variety of things that are passing, right? That's passing. I think maybe some centrality to certain forms of our cultural life that Jews played is passing.
Yeah.
And Terry is very much representative of that. The expectation that a person of high status would have some kind of culture, I think, is maybe passing or has passed. So there is a mourning. I mean, it's a mourning for Terry, who, of course, is still alive and still doing Fresh Air.
I was going to say, do we even know that she's retiring, or is she completely fed to this?
We don't.
She'll be like, "Dear Mr. Oppenheimer, I just signed a 10-year contract.
Right,
Fuck
exactly.
you.
I'm going to die in this chair in front of this microphone.
I just got some Botox. I just got, some. I have a blood boy. I'm going to stay healthy forever.
Blood boy. I cloned myself. I'm going to use their organs.
I'm the third Terry Gross.
So, I mean, it's it is. I'm just thinking about what motivated me to do this. I mean, there is that. There's a sense of a lot of things passing that part of this is mourning. And then part of it, I guess, is trying to think in a sort of more optimistic way about what kinds of adaptations would have to happen for its sort of, its divine essence to persist, but in a form that was more adapted to our current culture. Maybe, I don't know if it's a funny last thing to talk about. And I was sort of hesitant to talk about because I don't even know much about Sam Fragoso, and I've only listened to like a few of his episodes. It seems a little reckless to talk shit about him, as I imagine we're about to do, but I emailed him to see if he would be on this and he didn't even respond. So I think you brought him up to me and I didn't really know who he was. He's the host of this show, Talk Easy, which I think maybe has been on two different podcast networks. So he hasn't been on NPR. It's funny, though. He sounds like, if you listen to his show, I was listening the other day, he was rebroadcasting an interview he did with Seth Rogen after Rogen's show, The Studio, won some Emmys. That show is so engineered or reverse engineered to sound like Fresh Air, with the distinctiveness of Sam Fragoso, but that show sounds so much like an NPR.
You think he's auditioning for it? You think he's been auditioning for Terry?
I mean, I almost want to say he's been auditioning for it, or at least he's been auditioning fairly self-consciously for that role. I mean, it's exceptionally well produced. I'm not sort of criticizing the performance, but it's pretty striking. I don't think any of us who do this, you, me, Sarah Hepola, Mike Pesca, like none of us are unaware of the kind of Terry Gross and Fresh Air and NPR as the kind of template for a lot of what we do. But most of us are not trying to sort of like perfectly emulate an NPR show, and Talk Easy just seems like you can't listen to it and not think that in some sense that's what it's doing.
Right. I mean, I'm looking at his, I mean, I've listened to like 2 episodes and I remember thinking, he's not my vibe. I think he obviously is well prepared and a bright guy. And I've no shade to throw on Sam Fragoso. I want him to prosper. I want him to thrive. I wish him flourishing. I mean, it is interesting. If you look at the writers he's had on, it's exactly the ones you'd expect. It's like Ocean Vuong, Percival Everett, Jesse Eisenberg, who's a writer in a sense, Chris Hayes, Gia Tolentino, Richard Powers. It's celebrities. It's people who have like lots of buzz. Taffy Brodesser, actor, who's terrific, by the way. Like, and her books are I've read them both, and they're long and in some places challenging. And look, I'm jealous. Like, I wish I could land Richard Linklater. I would have a lot of questions to ask him. I think that's great, but he's not the droid I'm looking for. I mean, I think that there seems to be a kind of comfort zone there that, that he has this job and he's going to interview the people whose autographs he wants. I haven't listened to him enough to know if he's tougher on them than Terry Gross is on her guests. I mean, that certainly is something I would wish for from a future host, is a little more toughness. I don't know if you've gone back and listened to the episode where Bill O'Reilly walked off the set. The one where Bill O'Reilly walked off, I mean, he said, you had so-and-so on last week and you threw them all these hey, she'd had some lefty political person on. And he said, you just asked him about his puppies and whatever. And here you're asking me about these tough, like, you're really grilling me. Did you grill so-and-so about that? And there's this wonderful pause where she thinks about it. It's like, no, you're right. I didn't. And, she kind of admits, like, yeah, when I have identifiable conservatives on, I have to ask them about their politics. And my audience expects me to needle them. She doesn't say this, but you feel this is the confession there. And when I have, pre-approved liberal types on, I schmooze.
Grant them all their premises.
Yeah, grant them all their premises. And my sense is that Fregoso is a premise granter. That like he's not asking Percival Everett, what about the charge that your novels are of highly variable quality?
Right. Right. So I haven't listened to much Fregoso. I listened to, he did a good interview with Lena Dunham. I listened to part of the Seth Rogen one, but I made a point. I went and listened to this one. He had a moment. He had a Bill O'Reilly, Gene Simmons moment. It was with David Mamet.
Huh.
So he had David Mamet on. Now Mamet had just published, I think I'm right about this, had just published a collection of his political essays, or maybe relatively recently. In fact, it may have been the one that I reviewed negatively for the Washington Post. It was a piece of shit collection. He's incredibly lazy political writer. And it was it was kind of Fregoso in some ways at his best and worst. So he talked to him about the theater for the first, I think, 2/3 of it. And then he pivoted to the political stuff. And so it was at his worst in the sense that he did exactly what you're saying Terry did with Bill O'Reilly, which is he sort of treated him kind of oppositionally, antagonistically, in a way that there's just no way he would have for a liberal writer. At the same time, Mamet started to get pissed off and started to argue with him and started to be nasty to him, like interpersonally nasty to him. And then Fregoso was incredibly adept dealing with that in a variety of ways. Like he sort of paused and maybe took some of the points and sort of thought it through, but he also kind of slowed it down and kind of went meta on Mamet. Like, wait, what are you doing right now when you're saying that to me? That seems a little ad hominem. And I think there's like a direct parallel. I think it was Gene Simmons who said something to Terry. He basically said something about her like Gentile mouth. He just assumed she was a Gentile.
Right.
And Terry was like, just so you know, this isn't a Gentile mouth. And
boy, she was excited to be able to play that card.
Yeah. And so Mamet said something to Fregoso. He said something like, you don't know what it's like to be punched in the face. And it was clearly, and there was other stuff, and it was clearly like, you fucking pansy, right? Like I'm this like hard-bitten Jew, working class Jew from the streets of Chicago. And like, you're just some fucking femme pussy who's never like, and Fregoso was like, you're not talking to somebody who doesn't know what it's like to be punched in the face. But more than that, he actually just directly called him out on what he was doing. I mean, I don't know if he didn't literally say like, you're kind of gay baiting me or something like that.
Right.
But he said that. He's like, what are you doing right there? Like, you're not just.
This was basically Buckley Vidal all over again, right?
You're not just sort of kind of contemptuously gay baiting me. There's actually something threatening in what you're saying. You're saying you don't know what it's like to be punched in the face, but you're kind of saying I want to punch you in the face.
Right.
And he's totally had him dead to rights. And so it was really interesting because it was like part of the show I was like, this is bullshit. You're not even engaging. You should engage Mamet on his politics, but you're doing it in this kind of gotcha. Like you seem like you're performing for your liberal left-wing listeners or friends or something like that. You don't want them to think that you platform this conservative without giving it to them, right? In the kind of worst way that I didn't like, but then he was really fucking good at dealing with Mamet. It was really interesting. So, I don't know.
I mean, interviewing is an art. I think I'm like a B+ interviewer. I think you're better. I think there's a naturalness. You tend to kind of lose yourself in the ideas more. It feels more like a conversation, an unedited, unscripted, authentic conversation where you've sort of, as you know, I have a very close friend who used to be a TV anchorman. And one of the things he was trying to move up the ladder of anchor people. And he was at like a mid-size, call it an Albany or Springfield, but he wanted to get to New York or Philadelphia. And one of the things an agent told him, I think it was an agent who was kind of looking at his tape and said, you haven't crossed through yet. By which he meant you're smoothly, professionally, competently reading the teleprompter and performing the role of anchorman. But it still looks like you're performing the role of anchorman, whereas the great ones, the Tom Brokaws, the Dan Rathers, the Charlie Gibsons, they look like they're just talking to you. Like it feels natural. They're in your living room, they're talking to you, and that's what it is. And I feel my envy of people I think are better at this. Robert Siegel's very good at this. I think you're good at this. I feel like Ross is getting very good at this. I think Ezra Klein's very good at this. Is you sense that you're just eavesdropping on them in their living room, talking to someone they really want to talk to. And I feel like I'm always in my head trying to think like, how do I get the conversation to this point? And how do I come across? And, I'm having a good hair day or whatever. And that there's too much egoism in it. And maybe Fregoso's like, it's an art and maybe he's crossing through. Maybe he's just like in the moment, thinking on his feet, reacting. I think it's very interesting. I think you're very right to say that the danger is that it's some highly competent human, but just sounds like one other show.
I take the compliment and I appreciate it. Something that you're very good at that I need to figure out how to do, or hopefully can figure out how to do, and is fencing with somebody is the wrong word, is pushing somebody, but in a respectful way, but in an illuminating way on, whether it's their politics or their religion or something where you disagree with them, and not turning it into just a sort of point scoring debate, but doing the thing that we want from debate, which is kind of exploring the premises, exposing the vulnerabilities, making people kind of account for the underlying premises that they're not acknowledging. I feel like there was one of the episodes of your podcast where you did this recently, and I'm trying to remember
Was it
what
Matthew
it was.
Schmitz?
Yeah, maybe it was Schmitz. Were you pushing him on like his support for Trump or something
Yeah.
like that? And it was very good. And I'm afraid of it. Like, and I need to think through. I need to find my way into it. I mean, I need to practice it by doing it, but I don't know what the art of it is. My fear is I don't know enough. Like, I know a lot, but I think you've always been somebody who has a lot more of like the sort of details, the texts, the key citations, the key facts at your disposal, like stored in your brain. And I'm worried that if I'm faced with somebody who's not totally collaborative, who's not willing to meet me halfway, they're being sophistical or too debaterly about it, that I just won't be able to move quickly enough. I think the other thing is, like there's certain ways in which my brain is just not as fast as yours. It's not as fast as my wife's. Like I'm not being self-deprecating there. Like people's capacity to move in real time in certain ways is just different. And I'm very smart, but I'm not in the 99th percentile on that. But what is the art of it?
It's really how quickly your brain talks to your mouth. I mean, actually, your brain may be going every bit as fast. It's like how long is the lag time between what your mouth knows to say and what your brain knows to say. And for some people, it's very, for someone like a Christopher Hitchens, it was kind of identical. It was like he really just could talk in full paragraphs about, the thing he had in his brain could come out like that. I mean,
Ezra Klein is incredibly good at that.
Is incredibly good at that. I think, and this is the advantage you have. At the highest level, if you're comfortable in your own skin, it doesn't matter, because the worst that happens is some person who's not playing fair comes back at you with like the right statistic and feels that they've won the day. And then if you're really in the moment and comfortable in your own skin, you could say, I hear that statistic. Maybe you're right. And maybe you have more of those statistics, but are you really being honest with me about the flaws in your own position? Like, are you trying to score points, or are you really being candid about the soft underbelly or the Achilles heel of your argument? And I mean, it takes a lot of presence to say that, because what all of us immediately do is want to argue back rather than kind of ascending to the level of saying, what are we doing here? Are we trying to get at truth? I once did that really well with Dennis Prager, where he kept debating me on something. And I don't know, I was having a good day. And, all of us had bad days. And my bad days are often when I just try to match someone debate for debate, and nobody likes that. And I just kind of said to him, I was like, Dennis, I feel like you're not collaborating with me to get at the truth. and this drove him insane, because of course it was exactly right. He wanted to go out, and he kept having me back after the break. Like he was going to give me 5 minutes, and he ended up giving me like 7 5-minute segments, because what he was trying to do at every moment was go out on the break looking like the smart guy. And what I kept saying to him was, I think you're trying to look like the smart guy rather than trying to get at what's true. And it drove him bonkers. It was real. I got emails from people afterwards being like, wow, I've always wondered why I kind of love him but also hate him. And people are like, you were the first person to say he's not really a truth seeker. He's trying to win.
So did you get him into that space, or it was more that like you couldn't have, there was no getting him into that space, but you sort of at least kind of held him there and revealed kind of what the dynamic was?
I think I revealed him for what he was, which is just a guy trying to win and trying to flatter his audience. I will say that, somebody once told me that BBC interviews, or maybe I read this somewhere, are just like far more brutal about holding people to account. Like somebody wrote to me after my Matthew Schmitz interview and said, you were really good, but you didn't ask him about January 6th. Like you kept trying to say, wouldn't you agree Trump's a bad guy? And he was kind of hedging on that, but kind of giving a little bit, but he kind of got out of it, because at the end of the day, it's like, well, we're all bad guys. We're all sinful. We're all fallen. And somebody wrote to me and said, why didn't you ask him, does he think that Trump won the election? And if he doesn't, why doesn't he hold Trump to account for this massive lie that has real consequences? It's like, oh, that's right. And so, and I think the BBC hosts go in, I'm told, very good at just being like, but wait, what about this fact that's on the ground?
Yeah.
That we all have to acknowledge if we're serious people. I don't know. I mean, there's so many ways to go at this.
Yeah, there are. And it's interesting. And I think, one of the things you did with Schmitz, and that Klein often does very well, and this has to do with sort of preparation and maybe sort of insight going into it, you have to understand where the actual vulnerability is, right? The mistake that most people make is wanting to argue on the facts or something like that, or, your narrative doesn't make sense. And that only inevitably leads to just a kind of unilluminating, competing narratives, competing facts, and things like that. And you're like, I'm not going to argue with Matthew Schmitz about that kind of thing. I'm going to say you're a devout Christian. You're somebody who believes in the importance of character. You've chosen to support Donald Trump. How do you reconcile that? That's where the vulnerability for him is, where he can't simply evade it with he can, but it's much more difficult to evade it with some sort of debaterly tactic. And also, I think just if you recognize the character of the person, you're also looking for where they're more likely to hold themselves to account, right? Because we're all more or less vulnerable to certain kinds of critiques. And if you go at them with the ones that they expect, or the ones that are just easier for them to deflect, you're less likely to be successful in that. If you go at the ones where they're like, oh shit, like on some level, there's some inner voice that's like, I need to take some ownership of this, right?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it's almost like you'll get more out of flattering their view of themselves.
That's right.
Than you will attacking with your view of them or their politics or whatever.
So I guess our answer for this segment of the show is Ross Douthat, right?
It didn't occur to me till I sat down to talk to you, but I just, and again, I think it's his facility with all this stuff. I mean, the culture stuff, I just think it'd be so much fun.
He has an amazing brain, doesn't he? Aren't there these people who just they assimilate everything?
It's an amazing brain, but the thing that impresses me more about him is the wisdom of his temperament. His ability to not get pulled into dumb fights, his ability to not take stuff personally. And I think he would say it came from growing up in a family that was on a religious journey. And, his mother ended up with sort of trad Catholic spirituality and politics. His father, a little bit, more mainstream. But he would say, well, at 12, 13, I was always the kind of the weird person in these spaces where I had to figure out how to talk to my liberal friends.
Yeah.
But I don't think that accounts for it. I think it's very genetic. Like his ability to just remain sort of calm and irenic in the storm of anger, hatred, incitement, etc., and really try to talk to people in a way that hears them out and is persuasive. It's just super enviable. I'm always impressed by people. It's like when I meet teenagers, occasionally I'll meet a teenager college student who never got on social media. And I'll say, why? Mm-hmm. And I'll say, I just, my mom's on Facebook, my dad's on Twitter. I just felt like I wouldn't be living my best life. It's like it's like, who thinks that at 17? There's a Princeton undergrad I interviewed once. She's a senior now, who was just like, yeah, I just realized my college would be better if I weren't spending all my time on Instagram. It's like, all I thought about in college was like drinking, hooking up, trying to get an A- in a class I hadn't done the reading for. Like, how do you have that wisdom?
Well, you thought about, I'm not sure why this matters. Like, we cared about intellectual stuff, but we were just kind of pretty rough around the edges and immature in a lot of ways, right? Like, we cared about the deep stuff, but we did not have that sense of self-possession or wisdom or something like that.
And look, there are people who care about the deep stuff and are brilliant and are always kind of messes maturity-wise. One gets the sense right. Saul Bellow and Christopher Hitchens, and some of these people are total fucking messes their whole lives despite their brilliance. So, but it's that kind of, it's a sort of temperamental wisdom that I envy. But so, yeah, I mean, let's put that out into the universe.
Mike Pesca is the host of The Gist, which he claims, I'll take his word for it, is the longest-running daily news podcast in history. He's the author of its affiliated Substack, The Gist List. He has two other non-daily podcasts, Funny You Should Mention, in which he talks to stand-up comedians. I think that's a collaboration with the Comedy Cellar in New York. And Not Even Mad, which is dedicated to, quote, joyful disagreement. He brings on guests and has them disagree with each other and with him in a spirit of joyful disagreement. He's also the author of the book Upon Further Review, The Greatest What-Ifs in Sports History, which came out in 2018. He did also a limited-run podcast series related to the book. I think Mike, despite being by far the most experienced radio host podcaster among my guests, was the only one to respond to my question about whether he should be the successor to Terry Gross on Fresh Air by saying basically that he shouldn't. I think it's false modesty, but I appreciate modesty in any form, including its false form, so props to Mike for that. I really enjoyed talking to him. He and I had known of each other, but had never spoken before. I think maybe we'd both mentioned each other's names on our respective podcasts, so it was nice to be able to meet him, and he, as one might imagine, had lots of interesting thoughts on Terry. Mike Pesca, welcome to Eminent Americans. You're hereby anointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by the city of New York, where I lived for 5 years before, like everybody else who lives in New York when they're in their 20s.
I count the glance of the virtual sword on each shoulder. I assumed I felt it when you said it. I felt it touching. So thank you.
So I asked you on to talk about who should be the successor to Terry Gross on Fresh Air. I'm curious, when I asked you that, or to the extent you've thought about it at all, what direction did it push you? Was it who should be next? Was it what's interesting about Terry? Was it something about NPR? I've gotten all kinds of different visceral responses to the question.
Yeah. So first of all, I love Terry Gross and I love Fresh Air. I think when you said it, you didn't have the pause. She's great. It's not perhaps a bold statement to make, but these days when you say the obvious conventional wisdom, maybe with slightly more conviction, and know you're not going to get any credit for it, maybe there is credit. She is so good. And I do, by the way, think her current co-host is not nearly as good, I will say generously, and maybe leave it at that unless you want to get into it.
She's just high-level NPR generic. That's my sense of her, which is like nothing particularly distinctive. She's a pro. But like if the goal in imagining a successor is that the person be in Terry's league in one way or another, a distinctive presence in our sort of cultural landscape, she just doesn't meet that bar. She's perfectly fine, as is Dave Davies, who is, you know, the longtime occasional substitute host. But she's no Mike Pesca. She's no Mark Oppenheimer.
I think Dave Davies is pretty good. And his sports interviews for that, which is what I did for a long time for NPR, are well pitched to the NPR audience who might not know sports. But he also, and this is one of the two things I always tried to do, was talk to an audience who doesn't know sports, which are most people, but also if a sports person were listening, they wouldn't feel insulted. They wouldn't feel held by the hand. They'd get a lot out of it. So compliments to Dave. I think he does a good job. And they have a great staff, and like the average age of, or the average tenure of the staffer is probably a quarter of a decade by now. So they do coach up and also edit so that everyone will sound pretty good. But this is, you're right, tough shoes to fill. A friend of mine from high school still is a guy named Jay Fiedler, and he was the successor to Dan Marino as quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. So like, it's not as impossible a job as that, and you probably take a few fewer headshots as host of Fresh Air. But yeah, it's a tough one. So Terry's great. You know, her greatness sometimes gets in the way of the interview. So I'll tell you a little behind the scenes tidbit. I worked out of the NPR bureau for 8 years, maybe, and there was a dial on the desk such that you could listen to what was going on in all the studios. So Terry Gross would get people in and I would listen to the raw interview. And sometimes I would do that just because, I love this guest. I want to hear what Steve Martin has to say and I want to hear all of it. Sometimes I did it just, why not pick up some tricks from Terry Gross? Yeah. And so I did. And she taught me a lot about interviewing and a lot about, especially when I do the kind of interview I do where things can be cut. It's a very specific kind of interview. And the skill set really does allow you to, a lot of interviews are taped, but the ideal is live to tape. And so when you watch a late night talk show, which I guess aren't trying to be some great interviews, they really want to do it live to tape. Terry does not want to do it live to tape. And she'll ask many preambulatory questions. Is it okay if I ask this? Is it okay if I ask this way? You know what? Let's go back and redo that. And so I don't do that as much, but it was an education learning that. So yeah, Terry's great. And what I thought about is whoever we think should be the replacement, it's very important they not be famous outside the world of interviewing. I get very upset when I look at the Spotify and iTunes charts, and it's a bunch of people who are given credit for hosting good talk shows. And maybe they do. I'm going to try to think of a celebrity. You know what? I think Julia Louis-Dreyfus actually got
let's just name names because I'm thinking if I know, does Alec Baldwin, he had a podcast, maybe still does.
He was good. Yeah. I mean, he's still going.
Smartless guys.
Here's the thing. So they're terrible. Yeah. I mean, I will say it. They're never going to invite me on the show. And I kind of love them all in acting or even a personality standpoint. That show is terrible to me. And I know you could say, well, the shtick is they don't prepare, but okay, as an audience member, just listening to a show where the hosts are unprepared. And it's not so spontaneously delightful that it gets over that gigantic flaw in the middle of the show. So yes, that to me is the epitome of the talk show hosted by a celebrity where maybe the celebrity brings a Rolodex, certainly does, but nothing else. So I think we need to reclaim the idea of this person who is hosting one of the most listened to interview shows. Their job is professional interviewer, not guy who started in Arrested Development, who also knows a bunch of people who can be interviewed.
Where would you cut that? Because when I was talking to Mark earlier, the person we ended up talking about a fair amount as a potential successor was Ross Douthat. So Ross is not a professional interviewer in the sense that you are, nor is he, Jason Bateman or something like that. I mean, he's in that he's a journalist, right? So he's done a lot of interviewing. He's not a radio audio native guy. Like, is that type of person acceptable?
Oh, yes. I'm talking about the literal celebrity, the actor, the comedian, the person who probably hasn't thought about the craft of interviewing. Journalists, and a few on my list will be journalists, they come to it with a great skill set when it comes to eliciting information. So print journalists are ideal. I'm glad you talked about Ross. It's an interesting show.
You mean his, what's it called? Interesting Times, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's quite found its groove yet. It's new.
Yeah, but his Curtis Yarvin was great. And the greatest contribution to the Curtis Yarvin oeuvre.
I agree. I have my reason for why it was great, but tell me why you think it was great.
Because it wasn't about Ross saying, here, let me tell you my thoughts. It was about Ross letting Yarvin very much tell the audience who he really is. That's one of the main things you want an interviewer to do.
Yeah.
So we learn from the guest in a way we wouldn't have either by explicit questions or construction of the interview or where you lead them, the interviewee reveals themselves.
I agree. And I'm not sure if you drew this further sort of significance from it. I thought he did that, and essentially it was giving him enough rope to hang himself.
That was what it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not that that was necessarily Ross's intention, but it was just, I got to the end of that and I was like, this is the fucking guy who we have been so upset about. Like, this guy's a fool. Like, this guy is a kind of lightweight who hasn't really thought through all of his premises, who hasn't faced enough criticism. But that all happened by Ross just kind of, as you said, just like letting him go, right? And like laying the table for him.
And I think Curtis is a particularly unimpressive arguer and interviewer, and I've seen him in debates, so that's going to happen. And I bet Ross's plan was to allow that to happen. Now, when he interviews Peter Thiel, and if you and Mark talked about Ross extensively, and he wasn't on my list as someone who would fit into the fresh air slot. Peter Thiel's smarter and comes across better in interviews, but a version of that, at least we now understand who Peter Thiel is, and we understand that his priorities do not match the priorities or worldview of us, 90-something% of us, I think, thanks to Ross. Yeah.
So you listen to the sort of uncut Terry Gross interviews, and is it like an hour and a half or 45 minutes or something like that?
Yes.
What strikes you looking back on that somebody who just listened to the polished, edited version just simply wouldn't know about Terry or just wouldn't understand about the craft of her interviewing?
Lots of avenues that she might have foreseen only have a 40% chance of success. So I don't think she's taken wild, deep shots, right? Hail Marys, but very much you could see that she was constructing the interview. Let's see where this goes. Let's see where that goes. And when it doesn't go anywhere, it's not that big a deal. Also, every once in a while, an interview will air where the raw one was long and not bad.
Yeah.
In fact, pretty good. I remember there was a Drew Barrymore interview, and so much of it was Drew Barrymore just being so effusive in her praise with Terry Gross. She seemed like a very nice person who was very happy to be talking to Terry Gross, and that all went away. And I don't know what remained. And this wasn't a Drew Barrymore look back on her life. She was talking about a specific project, but it was one of those half interviews that was paired with another half interview when it finally aired. So they edit pretty ruthlessly. Another very important thing to know, which wouldn't surprise you, but that's how it goes.
Is there a way in which Terry, somebody who achieves that level of success and has that kind of discipline, I take it as a given that there's a kind of iron core of, maybe ambition is the wrong word, but there's an iron core of sort of command and decisiveness or something like that. And I'm wondering if that's evident in the uncut version, or if in fact, even in all of these interactions when she's sort of controlling the interview, she's just such an adept of kind of, softly engaging with people that that doesn't come through.
Right. So what you don't get is a helter-skelter approach where maybe some good drips and drabs can be cobbled together. You definitely don't come away with this. You come away with every chunk, even the ones that don't work, were given the best chance to work, stand up
Yeah.
on their own, could be incorporated into the rest of the interview. And I don't know if there's, she's by the way, she's like a 4'11" Jewish woman from Brooklyn. So as far as I can tell, the actuarial tables say they live to be about 115. These are the most resilient people on earth.
She's got 30 years left on her run.
Yeah. These are the people that will be returning a somewhat stale babka well into their 90s.
Right.
So I think she may be in that chair for a long time. I don't know that you can make the case, well, if we had to run the experiment 20 times, would Terry Gross achieve these levels of stardom? I think that there are many things that have to go right. And I think what she is a very competent, very intelligent person who grew into the job, who knows has a couple of North Stars, and big ones are be unbelievably familiar with the text. So she reads everything and sees everything, and it comes across. And by the way, who's a pretty good interviewer who always does that and isn't in my nomination list, but he's leaving the world of podcasts, is Mark Maron.
Yeah.
Mark Maron always engages with the subject. I have critiques of him, which is, especially when he talks to other comics, brings it around himself. There's a lot of soothing of the Mark Maron ego that must go on, but compliments to that.
But I thought Maron was notoriously unprepared. Doesn't he sometimes just kind of like riff through the Wikipedia page in real time?
I have heard him almost always talk about the project that the person is reading or promoting, and then other projects. I guess it depends on his level of interest. But I've heard him go back and talk about past projects that bigger name guests or ones that he's interested in. I do generally give him compliments for that.
Let's get to your list. Let's see what you got.
All right. So I think the guy who runs the best daily radio show in America is a guy named Colin McEnroe, WNPR at Hartford, Connecticut. He's in his 60s, I think, but his shows are great. Now, a daily call-in show is a different skill set, but Sam Sanders is someone in the NPR universe who I know they like.
I don't know who that is. Who is that?
Sam hosted a show called, I think, It's Been a Minute, which still exists. And then he went to host a culture show from Vulture. The economics of that weren't good. And now he still hosts a show. And NPR likes this. He's a gay black man. He's very personable. He knows culture well, younger culture. So I would say that if they were to tap someone, it would not surprise me at all if he would be on the list.
Does he have like whatever it is Terry has? Does he have some version of that magic?
I like Sam very much personally, and he's very smart and very skilled and has skills that a lot of other people don't. To me, a lot of his presentation comes across as a little, I don't want to say affected, but calculated. And I kind of hear this seems, he'll do a reaction, he'll vocalize a reaction that in a Michael Barbaro way, who's, by the way, I think great interviewer.
Oh, I forgot about him.
I think the shtick is quite apparent now. And I don't think Terry does that.
I was thinking about that. Mark and I were talking about, do you know this guy, Sam Fragoso, who has a podcast on...
6th on my list.
Okay. And I have very mixed feelings about him, but I was listening to one he did with Seth Rogen. And I say mixed feelings because, and some of it may be growing into the role. Sometimes it was like there was that performative quality, because the thing about Terry is, and who knows, maybe if I listened to like deep cut old school Terry, you would notice this, like it always feels totally authentic. It never feels performative in that way. And I think that's just key to good audio, right? Is not feeling like you're too aware of how the thing that you're about to do may come across to your listeners or something like that.
I mean, key to good audio is you and I listen to it or define it, but look at the list. Look at what are the popular talk shows. And I'm not even talking about shows that are just meant to be funny, shows that where the host would say, what I want to do is just what you said. I want to get to the deep truths of the guest. And there's so much clear performativity.
Yes. But we don't respect that, you and I.
I think it's good for entertainment value. It's not going to get you to replace Terry Gross.
So Sam Sanders, Colin McEnroe, who's 3?
I know this isn't ranked in order of anything, but I just wanted to say this is someone who would not do the job because she's not mostly culture. But of the big time network TV questioners, I think Margaret Brennan is the best.
No, I don't even know who that is. I'm so out of the loop.
Host of Face the Nation. Prepared, comes across well, asks pointed questions, is not so performative as, if I may critique Kristen Welker, who always have the same question, but will you rule it out? But will you rule it out? I mean, it's just like trying to engage in a meaningless political gotcha. And, I think that most of the people who host the Sunday shows do a fairly decent job. I used to think Chris Wallace was very good.
I never liked Tim Russert. I always felt there was some version of that. It just actually wasn't that interesting. It was just, you said this and now you're saying the opposite, and I'm going to show you the clip. I don't know. I know people love Tim Russert. I never got
he
with
did get a lot of, he was highly lauded for just reading the person's words back to them. So we said Sam Fragoso, who I just put out there because he is a person who, he has a background, I think, doing documentary films, but if the ideal is someone who is a professional interviewer, he is doing it. I think the skills would be transferable. I think his interviews are a little too moist, self-referential.
Yes.
You always know what Sam Fragoso means. I think the demands of just the media today are, he got into it with David Mamet and all the incentives are to do it, but my ideal NPR host would not, quote unquote, get into it with someone like that. You'd want the guests to just reveal themselves more.
Have you ever had a Gene Simmons or I'm trying to think what the famous kind of radio...
The walkout?
Or just, if not a walkout, a conversation that got hostile, sort of emotionally hostile?
Yes. I mean, I've done a few. I recently did one with a documentarian who did a podcast called Camp Shame about a fat camp called Camp Shane.
Uh-huh.
And I gave it enough room for her to talk about what I liked about the podcast, which was, it was a really interesting story of a fat camp, which is a real thing, and a very poorly run fat camp. But then and I'm sorry if I'm saying fat camp and your audience like, why did they say fat camp? Because that's what the camps call themselves.
Yeah.
But then we got into kind of a proxy debate about the ideology, which is a rigid ideology of the fat acceptance movement. And also, I think, a really inaccurate one in the Maha truthiness, non-grounded in scientific reality.
You mean they would say things like, there's no such thing as an unhealthy weight, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
And she was citing some statistics about the health of sumo wrestlers. And I came back with her with sumo wrestlers do die 20 years earlier. And it was tense. And my audience was a little bit split. Whenever I do it with a female guest, there's some portion of the audience who doesn't like me, quote unquote, beating up on a woman. So that was the most contentious.
Did you feel like you handled it well in retrospect?
I was really proud of that, because I thought that I made all my points. And it's not that I don't care if the audience, quote unquote, likes me, but it's a consideration way down the line. I know that if I present myself in a way that it's quote unquote unlikable, I've done something wrong.
Yeah.
But
did she know you were going to be somewhat oppositional?
No, she did not. But I told her in the beginning, I'm like, look, I really like it, but I do want to get into, she didn't know how much I would want to get into some of the ideology behind the fat acceptance movement. And so she wasn't ready for a debate. I mean, that when the interview started and before it rolled, I told her that, but we didn't book it with that in mind. But I still think she probably thought she came across well, because she said things she believed in a way that wasn't edited. There were no traps in there.
You have more people on your list?
I have a couple more Americans. David Marchese.
Oh, yeah.
New York Times, Culture. He did an interview. He did the Cameron Crowe one is up. It's really good. All of his interviews are, I think, really good.
The print interviews that they run in the magazine, which obviously highly edited down, are great. And he's obviously amazing at that. I haven't listened to enough of the audio, the actual podcast versions of them, to know how good he is or isn't at that.
He is good. He does his research. He did one with Vince Vaughn. Do you remember this? Where it took place over several iterations.
And he never got Vaughn to lock in, did he? Like, that wasn't that a weird one? I'm trying to remember. That was a very...
He was criticized, I think, from a journalistic standard, but I thought it was interesting. He revealed of himself some, I don't know, deaths of friends of his, and people, I think, criticized. I might be getting the criticism wrong, but it was something about how he was manipulative, or he came out swinging with Vaughn, maybe a little like the David Mamet one. I can't interview Vince Vaughn without holding him to task about being a Trump guy, if that's indeed what he is. And Vince Vaughn didn't quite take the bait, but I think he's a good interviewer. The last two American ones are, I don't know, and I haven't listened to The Treatment in a while, but I always thought Elvis Mitchell did such a good job. Did you listen to that show?
I mean, I've read Mitchell, when he was the film critic for the Times. I'm trying to think if I've ever listened to the show. Was it just an interview show?
Yeah, it was, I think, out of KCRW. And after he was bounced from the Times critic spot, that became his full-time job. But also he was a consultant with some of the studios. I just thought he asked great questions. At one point, he did a great Ron Howard interview. And at one point, he did a couple of good interviews he did great interview with Chris Rock, did a great interview with Dave Chappelle. At one point, Dave Chappelle kind of breaks character or just breaks the fourth wall and say, Elvis Mitchell, you just blew my mind. It was great. I told Elvis would also come into the NPR studio, and I said, you should do a promo where you just cut together people saying, Elvis, that was a great question, because they say that all the time. They said it to Terry too, but she would cut it out.
Yeah.
The other one is Mike Birbiglia does an interview with comedians, which a lot of people do, with Mike Pesca does. I do an interview show called Funny You Should Mention. And my point there is to try to talk to comedians who are making a point, comedians as the new philosophers or comedians as an op-ed page, kind of, talk to them as one would an op-ed writer. So Roy Wood Jr. was good at that. Other guys like TJ Miller, very hard to pin down, like pinning down a cloud. So he's not going to essentially buy into my thesis. But I told Mike, and, he's going to come on the show. And we've talked about this format. I'm like, you do it best.
What is it he's doing? Are they talking craft? What are they doing?
Everything. Sometimes he has a personal relationship with them. Sometimes he talks about how to punch up a joke. He talks about how to make your persona come through more. It is notable that I think it was last year, of the 3 or 4 shows nominated for Emmy Awards in stand-up, so one-person shows that went on to be considered more than just stand-up comedy, but qualified for this. He directed 3 out of 4 of them. He directed Alex Edelman's show that won the Tony. He directs most of the really great stand-up specials.
Okay, yeah.
And his own one-man shows are great. And he understands that really well. He also directs and writes narrative film, and he's working on a really interesting one now. He worked on one about when he was an improviser called, it was with Keegan-Michael Key, and Chris Gethard was in it. That was a great one. I think he would do well talking to all manner of cultural people, but I definitely know with comedy, he's great.
And you have some non-Americans? I'm assuming you have non-Americans.
Yeah, I think Helen Lewis. Do you know Helen Lewis?
Is she the one? There's 2 Helens. There's like Pluckrose and Lewis. Is she the one who writes for The Atlantic sometimes?
She does. There's also Shaw, who writes for the New York Times.
There's the Helen. There's the Jonathans, Shade Height. There's some other Jonathans too. I guess there's the Helens too. Yeah. This is Helen Lewis. Okay. Yeah. Does she have a podcast
She has a great podcast with Armando Iannucci. Where they talk about, it's a BBC show. I got to say, she carries them. And they talk about political language. And she's such a great talker and a great writer and a great thinker. And sometimes she comes in and co-hosts a show I love with 2 friends of mine named Blocked and Reported.
Oh, yeah.
And she's the best. She's the best co-host of that show. She'd be great.
That's interesting. I'll have to listen to her.
And here's my dark horse. That would be very polarizing. John Ronson.
Yeah, I just know him as a guest on some of the, he's on Fifth Column sometimes. I think he's done the circuit as a guest. He's charming.
Yeah, he's done a few BBC series. He's done it's 2 seasons of a show called Things Fell Apart, just kind of about cultural pressures and how crazy we went in 2020 and things like that. But he's really good at asking questions and getting things out of people and getting radical jailed leaders of separatist movements to be honest with him, but also talking to cultural people. He's a little off kilter. He talks in a way that's not just English, but a little bit slow. But that would be an interesting experiment. I don't know if the answer is he should replace Terry Gross. I know the answer is I'd like to hear him host a talk show.
So my last set of questions is, and I want you to do an honest self-assessment here, an honest audit of your own strengths and weaknesses. What are the pros and cons of Mike Pesca as the successor to Terry Gross on Fresh Air?
Oh, there are just way too many cons. Pros are, I think I would routinely every show ask a question or get an answer, even more importantly, that hadn't been answered before. And I am a good listener and in the moment, which is the most important skill, and will ask the question based on what the guest just said, not based on what I'm going to, have to get to on my list.
Something the guest hadn't said before, which is in a sense the holy grail. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but I've thought about this a lot whenever I'm interviewing, and I'm pretty new to this, whenever I'm interviewing someone who's done a lot of these, or if, they're doing the circuit because they have a book out, I'm sure you're haunted by this too, which is, if you do some homework and you listen to some other interviews, we all ask them the same questions, right? And if they're experienced, they often kind of have a automatic thing they go into. It's charming. They have their good, well-constructed answers and anecdotes and things like that. And so that challenge of like getting somebody to say something that they've never said before. I remember when Maron interviewed, there was a real drama to it in a sense when he interviewed Bruce Springsteen. My experience of it as a listener was Maron, and I think he was really good at this, was like coming at him from all these different angles to try and get him out of that. Bruce Springsteen's been interviewed so many times and he's, for good reason, so protected and so careful.
Yeah.
And it was like, and I think he did.
And at the drop of the hat, he could give a 15-minute soliloquy that could slot right into the bridge of Kitty's back or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So like, and I think he did. I think he got him out of that. But I've thought about that. Like, what is when you say that you would get that out of somebody, is it just the listening? Is it just the listening to what they're saying and looking for opportunities or sort of pockets of energy or tension? Is that the trick? Is it prep? I don't know.
Those are the two things. And listening to all the other interviews they've given and knowing what they're going to say, and even said, I've heard in other interviews you say, and then as a listener, as a critical thinker, you're not looking to poke a hole, but you're looking to ask the follow-up question that none of those hosts did ask or whatever is implied. And then if you just listen to what they say and they lead you down a certain path and you ask questions based on that, you get good stuff. This derails the direction of an interview. So if you're hosting an NPR show and you have, even if it's not a live interview, that's its own thing, even if ideally you're doing an interview that'll air in 3 days and you have a 7-minute slot, you don't want to do that. You definitely don't want to do that too early because you'll screw up the entire production team. And 7 minutes really isn't so much that you're going to be able to go down these unexplored byways and mine some gold. So
yeah, and I think even with whatever it was, the 40 minutes that Terry had for Fresh Air, there's probably 33 minutes of that kind of has to be in there, right? If you're interviewing.
That's the other thing. When you and I say we want to get something new, is that selfish, or how much are we serving the audience? Will the audience have heard 3 minutes with this person? I mean, there's a reason why it's the 5 W's and the who, what, when, and where. And you don't want to be the most cliched and maybe the best. This is the argument.
I struggle with that in my own interviewing because I'm just so easily bored, and I just don't want to listen to somebody talk about something that I've heard them say in other interviews or that I know that I'm going to say. And so then I'm doing a disservice to the listener because 99% of them don't have, in their head the kind of battery of answers that person gives. And I mean, even to the point of I don't want them to tell me about a book that I've already read, right? That they wrote. It's like, well, I already know what the book is about or something.
Yes, but you're a proxy for the audience. You have to be. Yeah,
right. But it's tough because I sort of vacillate, and there's probably some relatively happy medium. It's like, on the one hand, I don't want to bore myself, and the audience probably suffers for that. On the other hand, there's a lot of people like us who listen to a lot of these things and know a lot of stuff like that. And what that means is there's a lot of podcasts that just bore the shit out of me because I already know. I know what I know what you're going to ask. I know what that person's going to say. And 85% of this interview, I don't need to listen to because it. And so for me, that particular kind of consumer, they're doing a disservice to me because I just don't want to listen to that stuff I know already. But that's not most listeners.
Right. And I also think in the ecosystem of today, your instinct is the right one in that they'll be able to get this so many other places to differentiate yourself. You should not ask them about the book that you already know about. I was interviewing the showrunner of the new Amanda Knox series on Hulu. And this helped the interview. I'd already interviewed Amanda Knox, and we haven't played it yet. We're going to play that beforehand. So interesting questions for Amanda Knox, but you also get the broad strokes of what happened. And so the director of the series really could just concentrate. There was kind of a gift on the specific directorial choices of how she presented different things. So we didn't even have to do the exposition of, and then when the body was found, and then the prosecutor, who was also the investigator, charged her with whatever, and she was in jail with however many years. And it was good. And at one point, the showrunner, who impressed me, she had worked on This Is Us, that NBC show. She said, and I had listened to hours of tape and read hours of transcript, and what I found was, and because I was listening, I said, wait a minute, did you acquire this through whatever the Italian version of freedom of the press is? And we got into a little bit of the intricacies of how one would find out about the Italian investigation system. Now, I know that she hadn't talked about that with anyone else, because everyone else doing a Hulu interview about Amanda Knox is, well, was she really guilty? And
Right.
Isn't it bad that a woman comes across and is deemed a murderer because she giggles a little? So if you ask me, what are my strengths and weaknesses? If I bring the Fresh Air audience an interview with the director of the Amanda Knox story, and we spend 15 minutes on Foia, the Italian version, Foia, I don't know how many people will like it.
Right. I love that stuff, but it is self-limiting, right? I mean,
It's niche-y, right? It's niche-y, and it plays well against the backdrop of you can hear these people everywhere else. On Fresh Air, the idea is this is your first listen. Most of our listeners over the air, half of them have never listened to a podcast. They listen to Fresh Air to hear an interview about Amanda Knox, and that is the one interview they're going to hear.
Yeah. And I would say there's an awful lot of people, and I mean, we're all like this in some sense. Like I haven't watched all 3 seasons of Reacher because I'm like compelled to always seek, non-formulaic content, right? Where a lot of people who are consuming that particular kind of stuff, they actually want what's expected, right? And they want a sort of confirmation of their worldview. I don't happen to in this space, but certainly I do in lots of other spaces. So I'm not critical of the instinct. But I was going to say, even if it's not totally novel to you, I think there's a lot of people who are perfectly happy to listen to Terry ask the expected questions of someone and get the expected answers. It's sort of soothing and affirming and pleasurable.
There's that, but also realize that if a different interviewer, if someone on the junket did that, the person answering the question would be so bored by then, or
Right.
so uninterested in asking the local Akron answering the question. When Terry asks it, because it's Terry and she earns it, people do bring their A game.
Yes. What's an interview for you where you felt like you had that just kind of like interviewer's thrill, where you just like, you got them going and you could just tell they enjoyed it? It was some famous person who just was like, barely knew you from Adam. You were on the sort of, their publicist had set it up for them. They just thought it was gonna be another boring one. And then they're like, oh, this guy, I find him interesting. I'd like to, I could imagine having a drink with him. You know what I mean? I know you know what I mean.
Yeah. Chris and Paul Weitz of Murderbot, and also of American Pie, and also of like Weird Things, where they didn't always work together. And they did say they knew me to butter me up, maybe. But it was great. And we went in all these crazy directions. And then I indulged myself with, what about this theory? What about that theory? But they seemed thrilled to play that game. So yeah, that's always thrilling when that happens. I will say, this hasn't come up before, but I was just thinking about it. I would give an A+ to generally Terry's culture interviews. I think I might give an A- to B+ to when she gets on a New Yorker writer to talk about the latest in immigration news or the latest Trump initiative, in that it's never bad.
Yep.
And I'm always 100% sure the writer comes away saying, well, that was the best interview I'm going to do about this, or more people will have heard that than read my story. But I know she doesn't push back. I mean, maybe once in a while, and it won't come across as pushback, and it will come across as strengthening the thesis. And so there's another thing that I'm always going to do, which is to push back, especially these days. A lot of, I think, we could talk magazines all day, but to me, the New Yorker has gone down a couple rungs in terms of go-to gold standard. And I think the Atlantic has taken its place, actually.
Have you ever met Terry?
Yes. And she was very nice to me and claimed that she loves my stuff when I was a sports reporter. And I said, oh, you should have me on the show sometime. But that's not what they do. And I felt like really embarrassed afterwards. Very embarrassed.
That's why I want to do the show for another 30 years, because I can hold on to the hope of being interviewed by Terry, which
you put out cultural products where it's possible. I, as just a sports reporter who, I'm going to come on and talk about the Ravens run game?
Surely you have, maybe not surely. Do you not have like whether it's a kind of limited edition podcast series or a documentary or a show, do you have any irons in that fire? Are you all audio?
Well, I did write a book about sports what ifs, and I did have a few long-term series. But the thing about the Everyday Show is whatever ambitions that you have other than the Everyday Show, and I'm putting out a Substack of sort of a news rundown called the Gist List. I'm doing that every day as well. People could subscribe to that on this very, very platform. That takes a fair bit of time. And then I mentioned I have the other podcasts that aren't the Gist, Funny You Should Mention, and I do a debate one called Not Even Mad. So none of these would get me interviewed by Terry Gross, I don't think.
Well, don't give up hope.
Mike Pesca, you write the Gist List. Tell me what you thought of this funny article out of Akron.
We're young yet. Maybe we'll get on to whoever her successor's thing. Well, Mike, I really appreciate it. It was nice to meet you. I think you undersell your potential as potential successor to Terry. And, this is I don't know if there's any NPR producers listening to this, but, this is your opportunity to just let them know that you're available for the job. We're all fucking available for the job, right?
Listen, if NPR producers are listening, all they're hearing is mic noise. They can't not hear the banging on the mics that the two of us have done a couple times. That's all they hear.
That's going to give me a complex. I'm trying to think of who's your number one. You didn't actually say. You had like 10 or 12 people.
Look, we need to do this tomorrow. Terry's out returning that babka. I'd call Colin. He could step right in and do it. And then if it was Hail Mary, hey, let's just try the wildest idea. And the wilder it is, the more we'll pay you. I would maybe ask Helen or John to do it. An English person.
Okay, I like that. That would work well for NPR, let's be honest.
You get the 20% benefit of the accent.
Jesse Adams, my final guest, is the author of the Ivy Exile Substack and a writer for, among other publications, The Washington Examiner and The New York Post. His is an interesting conversation to end on, I think, for two reasons. One is that Jesse really has more of an ideological critique of NPR and the establishment media in general than any of my other guests. Plenty of them have critiques of the media, but Jesse's is more pointed and I think more vehemently felt. And also, not unrelated, he just has strong emotions about where NPR has turned, what it's like. I don't agree with all of his observations, but I appreciated him being open about his feelings about it in a way, both because that's just good radio, good audio, but also because it speaks to something that is a point that I think I made once or twice during these two episodes, which is that NPR has been a pretty intimate part of people's lives, in some cases for decades. It's not just a piece of media that we consume. It's this kind of series of voices that go directly into our ear. Often we have on for hours a day. Terry, probably above any of the other hosts on NPR, is kind of an embodiment of that, a personification of that. She's our friend. If Terry were to somehow turn against us in some way, that would hurt, that would cut deep. So, it speaks to kind of why this felt like a rich subject to take on. So thanks to Jesse for opening up in that way, and thanks to all my guests and to you, the listeners, for joining me in this endeavor. I have no immediate plans to do another special episode. I have no concepts in my mind, but this felt like a success to me, which is enough for me to become convinced that I will do it again at some point on some topic. Anyway, on to the conversation. Peace. Jesse Adams, welcome to this special episode of Eminent Americans. We're here to talk about Terry Gross, NPR, Fresh Air, and I think I wanted you to come on maybe less about who her successor might be and more about our feelings, our collective or respective feelings about NPR as a whole, because I think there's a broad feeling, and I know you have this feeling, that NPR went askew at some point in the last few years. Why does NPR need to course correct, and how should we start to think about what that would look like?
Well, my dad was a very regular NPR listener, probably most days, so it was just sort of the fabric of what I grew up with. And if I were to assess the state of NPR circa, say, 2005, 20 years ago, I would say there was definitely a perception of bias, and it leaned distinctly left, but at the same time, it was just so damn good. There was nothing really like it that even a lot of conservatives would listen to NPR, and there might be a little filter, or there might be, oh, well, let's turn that 10 degrees to the right to sort of get the reality. But this is amazing content. As an educated person, you should really probably be aware of. Then came the Obama years, and I think NPR interpreted this generational shift to Obama as something that was going to be permanent. And so it ended up sacrificing a lot of its credibility. It was just too one-sided, and it wasn't something that people that weren't already inside the tent could hear. And so their existing audience was thrilled. I mean, a lot of people, well, this is perfect. This is resistance.
I mean, if we're going to stereotype a little bit, it's probably not that much. The progressive, educated, upper middle class audience.
And particularly the foundations in a position to give out the grants. And the foundation sector is it's never quite fair to equate the prejudices of philanthropists to the left writ large, but they certainly have disproportionate influence.
That's interesting. So you actually chart an important turn in NPR back to whether it's like 2008 proper, but that's sort of the Obama administration, so 2008 to 2016. I say that's interesting because I don't think the narrative, the sort of conventional narrative among people who think that there was a kind of hard left turn in a way that corrupted, in some sense, the NPR they'd come to know and love, is really the last 10 years, is really the wokeness era, maybe 2015, 2016 on, and then kind of supercharged for a while from 2020 and George Floyd, but you're actually tracking it back. I certainly didn't feel like I noticed some change in NPR, at least in a way that bothered me during the Obama administration. But you did, or you're sort of doing some kind of historical work and thinking that it started there, but we kind of only started to notice it in the last, decade?
Well, I think it's kind of convenient to date the beginning of the problem to George Floyd. But the ground had already been laid for that a long time before. So in my view, the Obama campaign and then Obama getting elected was probably really when the swerve first happened. But even more so when Obama got reelected, people just fell into this fantasy of the convenient Democratic majority. And I think a lot of people at NPR started to see their mission as sort of being the cleanup crew to advance that new reality of a one-party society. And it blew up in their faces, unfortunately.
I'm sort of debating whether to get into the Obama thing. Like, I'm not sure you're wrong. I'm not sure I'd argue with you that there may have been some shift because, I mean, I remember when Obama was elected and there was a real kind of, for at least for people like me, there was a real euphoria around it for a variety of reasons. But I also think of Obama as somebody who is very much of the kind of old liberal establishment order and not the new woke one. I mean, he really is a kind of universalist, a sort of integrationist, a moderate liberal who I think is pretty invested in sort of philosophical liberalism in a way that a lot of times the kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about the woke left isn't, is a true left in a sense of having some skepticism towards ideas of free speech and civil discourse and robust conversation and things like that. But maybe I don't want to get detoured in that because I want to stay on Terry Gross. Do you think, and I don't know how consistent a listener, I never had the sense that Terry took a strong turn in any meaningful sense, that maybe the composition of her guests shifted to reflect some of this sense. And I would say particularly in the last few years, so she's going to have on more people, more authors of color or more people who are trans or things like that. But Terry's approach, in a sense, has been pretty consistent. Do you have any specific critique of her or maybe the other kind of non-political kind of flagship? I'm just thinking of like This American Life, Wait, Don't Tell Me, or things like that. Have those shifted as well, in your opinion? Or is it more that just like NPR can't move forward without a sort of clear sense of some kind of repair or correction it needs to do, even for those properties that maybe didn't suffer particularly from the bias that you're talking about?
A lot of the issue with NPR is tone and, the famous NPR voice that they make fun of on SNL and all of that. The thing is that there's an entire cosmology in the tone, the sort of let's speak slowly, let's speak softly, let's be calm and rational here, that implies a certain arrogance. Maybe arrogance is ungenerous, but how about a technocratic certainty that we adults in the room can talk this out in a rational way and move forward and solve it. And that's a great, wonderful thing if you're bringing on a reasonable mix of guests. But once you're bringing that sort of what could be read as slightly smug and condescending tone into talking to people who are nutty by the standards of the average American, the tone serves to discredit itself if they're not speaking to people who are evidently of intellectual seriousness. So it's different for Terry Gross to talk to somebody from National Review, for instance, or somebody from The Atlantic or Harper's versus talking to Ibram X. Kendi. By trying to read Kendi into this circle of enlightened discourse, you're just sort of obviously cheapening yourself in doing so.
I have two separate kinds of thoughts. One is I'm thinking that maybe there's actually two NPR voices. And you have some background in radio, so I'd be interested kind of your take on this, which is like voice one is maybe more the one you're describing, which is the voice of Morning Edition, the voice of the straight news operation. And then voice two is this it's not that the way you described it is wrong, but it's more idiosyncratic in a sense. It's like Ira Glass, Terry. I mean, it's all these, I hate to put it this way. It's all these big Jews, right? And so it's this, it's this relatively sort of nasally Jewy voice, which I probably have too, which is different, I think, from the Morning Edition voice. I mean, they may be part of some sort of, overarching cosmos or something like that, but I think they are two distinct voices, because one of the innovations, I think, of NPR in its modern era with these phenomenally popular shows like Fresh Air, like This American Life, was the introduction of this voice that would have been very strange to hear on the radio 40 years ago or something like that. So that's one thing I want to say, and I'm interested in your feedback on it. Another thing is just so I think I can understand, and I haven't observed this, but I will believe you if you say it's the case, which is I could imagine a difference in how Terry talks to somebody who's presumed to be part of the tribe, right? Part of the good progressive tribe, and how she talks to somebody who's a conservative. And it just has to do with the level of, it's subtle stuff, right? It's subtle and not so subtle stuff. It's how challenging is she in her questions to them? But then how warm is she, and how many to what extent does she just to kind of defer to their premises? And I can imagine, though I didn't observe, that there would be a subtle transition in those things, where 15 years ago, if Terry Gross had on some conservative writer or something like that, she would have just treated them as she would any other guest, where there's a kind of deference to their narrative. And that maybe in the last 5, 10 years, 15 years, more contrarianism crept into her interviews with those people. So I could imagine that happening. I haven't observed that it does. So you respond to either or both of those, but I'm just kind of thinking about that because that does get to a question for the next host, whoever they are, whether part of what they need to do is sort of think through what's their stance towards guests, right? They can be more oppositional, they can be more critical or challenging, but if so, they may want to apply a kind of roughly universal standard to all the guests, no matter their political opinion. So if it's Ibram Kendi, put him on the spot. I think Ezra Klein, for instance, in the last few years has been pretty good about that. Like his last interview with Ibram Kendi, as opposed to his previous interview with Ibram Kendi, was really confrontational. I mean, not hostile, but just he put him on the spot. And so he, at least, I think, has shifted course to recognize that he needs to be confrontational with guests from both sides of the spectrum, but I'm not sure. So anyway, I said to respond, and then I kept going.
Yeah, I guess with regard to Ezra Klein specifically, I would say when I think of the Klein brand, I don't think confronting Kendi the second time is kind of enough to bail him out from having been perhaps more, I don't know the word to use, more friendly and embracing of Kendi the first time. I mean, it's going to take more than one Sister Souljah moment to back off from the credibility that was lost. In the bigger picture, I started my career in alt-rock radio, but the bulk of my public broadcasting experience as a job was I worked for the Bill Moyers in his PBS show. And so I've written about the PBS NewsHour. My proposal is kind of a devil's bargain that PBS should receive public funding, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting shouldn't have been zeroed out in terms of public funding. But the cost of that is I think they should get out of the news business altogether. I mean, I love a lot of my former colleagues who are still doing some of those jobs, but
It should all be sort of like Regency era costume dramas and British mysteries.
well, yes, but also American Masters has
American
wonderful,
Masters, American Experience.
yeah,
like,
Nature. I mean, there are wonderful shows that, you know, you can point at Nature and say, well, they sure talk about climate change a lot, but the heart of Nature is incredible footage that is of genuine public value.
Is that to say that the next host of Fresh Air should be no host? That if NPR wants to regain credibility, it needs to. That doesn't really make sense because it's a fundamentally news producing organization in the sense that PBS is not.
My argument was really specifically about PBS versus NPR. I think it would be doable for PBS in a way that it wouldn't be. I would advise NPR probably pivot to more local programming, but Fresh Air isn't going to go away. But in terms of what I'd said about the news hour, a lot of the bias is unconscious or otherwise just very subliminal. So I'd use as an example, on Friday evenings, they do their left-right roundup, which used to be between Mark Shields and David Brooks. And then rest in peace, Mark Shields. I loved watching him. But when he couldn't do it anymore, they replaced him with Jonathan Capehart. And at least at that time, Jonathan Capehart was still affiliated with the Washington Post. But he dramatically resigned from the Washington Post in protest of Jeff Bezos and is now just on MSNBC. And so the NewsHour left-right talking head is Jonathan Capehart as this extremely devoted doctrinaire Democrat versus David Brooks, who I respect quite a bit, but probably hasn't voted for a Republican since 2004 at minimum. And so framing that as, oh, this is the real conversation here is just so profoundly different from what an American at a, you know, the diner in Iowa or whatever, how they would perceive what is the actual left-right dynamic. And so as far as Fresh Air specifically is concerned, I think they really need to pivot to speaking to that kind of diner, or at least the most educated person in that diner. Just who's a host that's nuanced, that's an honest broker. I think NPR needs to get back to they're an honest broker that might have a little bit of their own spin on things. And that's fundamentally what's been lost.
It's interesting. I mean, I probably agree with that. I was going to say where I differed from you. You said, you know, it's going to take more than one sort of confrontational interview with Ibram Kendi to restore Ezra Klein's credibility. And what I disagree with is just like, I think I have a much shorter memory or more forgiving orientation towards this, but I think the public does too, which is I do think NPR forfeited a fair amount of its credibility for a while. I don't think, and it doesn't sound like you're actually saying this either, like I don't think there is or really could be plausibly some massive pivot where they start replacing like, you know, liberals with conservatives or something like that. Their audience is going to be their audience, right? But I would say that the road back is actually not that far. You know, if they did something like, I mean, and you can see this at the Times, right? So Ross Douthat's new podcast is not exclusively like people who are sort of genuine Trumpies or people who are, but it's Curtis Yarvin, it's Kieperman, I think, Jonathan Kieperman. He's talking to some of these people and he's challenging them, but he's giving them, but he's also treating them with a certain degree of sort of civility and respect, which is the way in which Ezra Klein or NPR would treat a liberal politician, right? I mean, if NPR started doing that, if they had a host who brought on people like that, brought on people on the left, people on the right, people in the cultural space, whatever else, and just kind of treated them fairly, then I think they would regain credibility very quickly because they're still quite good at what they do. Like, you know, it's like with the Times, like as opposed to who, right? It's like it's the New York Times. Like, I mean, and more, like there's nobody to replace it. There's certainly nobody on the right side of the spectrum. There's no right wing NPR. I mean, there are good conservative podcasts, but like there's just nothing else that's in the remotely the same sphere in terms of the sort of, you know, excellence of content and production value and things like that. So I think it's less of a haul back into a sort of place of nice center-left respectability than you might be suggesting.
I guess some of it goes back to COVID and how do you interpret what was done during COVID? Was it technocratic experts doing their best, or was it people fundamentally moving to exploit the situation to move their political goals down the football field? So my sense, for me, I was working at Columbia's School of Public Health doing their 100th anniversary during COVID. And
Belly of the beast.
yeah, it could not have been any more. And it shattered my faith in technocracy. I had thought that I was cynical. I had thought that I couldn't go any further down that way. And it's my view that sort of much of the American establishment colluded 4 or 5 years ago pretty shamelessly to try to achieve a one-party state. And I understand that realistically, you can't always expect an apology and for the Band-Aid to be ripped off. And in order to limp along, everybody needs to be able to save face. And that's certainly what Columbia is trying to do right now in the wake of its legal settlement. But for me, it's just not enough. And with NPR, just sort of all of these stories of just really mindlessly regurgitating all of this pop intersectionality, just year after year, everything is climate change. Everything is it's heterosexual white people's fault. I mean, I think the trust was shattered more fundamentally than being able to kind of scotch tape it back together again.
You know, it's interesting, and one thing that occurs to me, and I don't have the same perspective you do. I mean, I have my criticisms, but I wasn't alienated in the same way you were, and I don't have the same level of sort of fundamental condemnation of the whole enterprise. I don't want to argue about that. The point that I'll take from it, which I think is a really valuable one, is the technocratic voice. I mean, let's just think of it in the terms of like what can earn authority or what can kind of claim or win over authority from an audience. The technocratic voice has really suffered a blow, right? And this is part of the whole deterioration of the authority of institutions, which preceded COVID, right? I mean, it was accelerated by COVID, but it preceded COVID. And lots of people have written a lot about this. I think this is like the Martin Gurry line. And I think what it suggests from a sort of media perspective, if you're thinking about how to operate within this new ecosystem, where you can't just assume a certain kind of deference to kind of mainstream institutional authority, is what kind of voices are succeeding, right? So the next Terry Gross maybe can't be somebody like Terry Gross because that is her voice. It's not a knock on Terry. It's not a knock on me. It's probably my voice in some way, right? But it's like, there has to be a kind of messiness, right? Like, and it's not that you literally sound like Joe Rogan, but I think there's a kind of looseness, there's a kind of messiness, there's a kind of openness to correction or humility about how authoritative a perspective that you're coming from that probably is in some sense the voice of the future. And I actually think, like, if you're thinking about the Times, they're probably already better about this. Like, I actually think you having the kind of voices like Douthat and Klein and whomever else, like they're not all the way in that direction, and it still is the New York Times. And I don't think the voice of authority is going to totally go away. But if you're imagining just a kind of, and this is going to be tough for NPR because it's so coded into their DNA, that technocratic, good, goo-goo, progressive voice, but it's like, if we could pick anyone, if we could give them advice, it would be a different kind of voice. I mean, does that make sense to you? You know, without debating how worthy these institutions are of Compton, they've lost authority whether they deserve it or not, to the degree that you think they do.
I guess I would liken the trust that was broken to, let's say you have a married couple that was squabbling, and you've got one of them just blurted out, "I want a divorce." Well, maybe they didn't actually want a divorce. Maybe it was just spoken in the heat of the moment, but it becomes a pregnant fact that can't be taken back. And I think the New York Times, with just embracing the whole DEI smorgasbord of wokeness, just kind of blurted out to American people who weren't already on board 100% that in some way we're done with you. I'm from St. Louis, as I'd mentioned before, and we had Michael Brown and we had Ferguson and all of that writing. And I'm very sorry for what happened to Michael Brown, but a hard reading of the facts of the case, as both the grand jury and Eric Holder's Justice Department found, there was no probable cause for it not being justifiable self-defense. There was no reason for them to indict the officer. Well, but yet we had years of rioting. And when George Floyd happened, there were all these people at the statue of St. Louis that was the city's symbol before the arch was built, literally demanding that the statue be torn down. And so it seemed to me in summer 2020 that not only was this wonderful old statue that was the symbol of the city going to be torn down, but they might possibly rename the city. And if they were going to rename the city, it would probably be for Michael Brown, even though that case didn't hold any water whatsoever. And so that rocked me existentially in a way that the New York Times picking itself up and dusting itself off, and let's just put this unfortunate episode behind us and move on civilly. How am I supposed to do that when the New York Times has said that in terms of my identity categories, I'm like you in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm Jewish. I went to a good school. I'm reasonably affluent. I am NPR voice in a lot of ways, but I'm also, my dad was a working class white guy from St. Louis. Like, my family, my tribe includes the people who were rendered untouchable for 10 years, that were consistently vilified by outlets like the New York Times and NPR. And so them stopping the vilification and just moving on, that's better than actively being attacked, but it doesn't make all that water under the bridge go away. And it makes building that bridge a lot more complicated, that there's just so much water under there. So I don't think it's realistic to expect the people who were actively dehumanized year after year and sort of this full court press that became pretty dramatic under Biden-Harris. It can't be moved on. It's too big for a Band-Aid. The bone is broken.
Let me put it this way then. So less a question of what would sort of fully regain the trust of somebody like you who felt as kind of alienated from it as you are, and put it a different way, which is, what is a voice you could hear at a sort of flagship radio show like Fresh Air that doesn't kind of make you forget everything that you're upset about, but just makes you pause and say, okay, that's a start. You can think of, like, I'm thinking about, for instance, and I'm not sure where in the chronology of it was, and so this may not make sense in terms of the chronology, but when the New York Times hired John McWhorter as a columnist and newsletter writer, I thought to myself, well, that's interesting, right? That's a meaningful gesture, right? It doesn't solve everything or fix everything or change everything, but that's not an effort to just cover over what happened before. That is an effort to sort of speak to the public in a different way. Of all the people you listen to or read, is there a person who you would hear, and there was an announcement that Fresh Air has appointed a host after Terry's retirement, and it's this person, where you'd say, oh, okay, that's interesting. Not necessarily I'm ready to give NPR a chance, but I'm ready to give Fresh Air a chance.
I guess I would compare John McWhorter, who I respect a great deal, to kind of like a David Brooks figure. He's coded as quasi-conservative if you're standing on the left. But people on the right look at John McWhorter and he still votes for Democrats. I reviewed his latest book, which was about pronouns, and it was really implicitly an argument for, if people want to be called they, language changes all the time. Allow them that dignity. So from the New York Times perspective, hiring John McWhorter is, whoa, that's a little transgressive. We're really course correcting here. And I think if you're not in that bubble, John McWhorter seems maybe a little too late.
But you're willing to go David Brooks as the next host of Fresh Air.
I think David Brooks would be seen as sort of maybe a squirrely choice, as we're trying to feign a course correction without actually doing a course correction. So I actually think David Brooks would compound the problem. It wouldn't please their existing base and it wouldn't bring in anybody new. John McWhorter himself, I think, is a very interesting suggestion. There's a guy named William Brangham, who I used to work with, who's a correspondent for the NewsHour, who I think could transition into being closer to what they need to do without maybe pissing people off. But I'd add, why not you, Daniel? Why not all these different people on Substack who are podcasting, who are honestly coming from where they are and doing their best to introduce a little bit of nuance and organicness to the conversation? I would do what Jeopardy did when Alex Trebek died. Don't just choose somebody, try a bunch of people. I thought LeVar Burton would be the perfect host to Jeopardy because I loved reading Rainbow. He was terrible. He talked to the contestants all like they were children. I mean, I couldn't wait for him to go, but I had to see him do it before I knew. So look at the 50 top political podcasters on Substack. Give them all a try. See what the public likes. Let's make a carnival out of it.
That's a good note to end on, Jesse. I got to run. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. A pleasure.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Ownsworth of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did, if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.